I got a brand new sweetie, better than the one before. Oh, she's got everything and a little bit more.
Hello, and welcome to Additional History, Headlines You Probably Missed. I'm your host, Tiffany Clark, and this is the 268th episode of this podcast. If you happen to be new here, this is the podcast where I pick one day in history where something important happened. I tell you a little bit about it, and then I tell you 3 more stories that were also making newspaper headlines on that exact same day. It's a fun way to learn about stories you've probably never heard before. Sometimes they're funny, sometimes they're heartwarming, sometimes they're scary, and sometimes they're even a little bit gross. But they're always interesting. Today's episode date is one that you'll most likely know as soon as I say it. And you'll probably even be surprised why I haven't covered it yet. I'm taking our headline of the day from the April 9th, 1865 edition of the Memphis Bulletin out of Memphis, Tennessee. The headline says, "Very latest by telegraph," and then a bunch of other stuff, and then it says, "Lee expected to surrender." Friends, April 9th, 1865 was the day that Robert E. Lee, General of the Confederate Army, officially surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant, General of the Union Army. Like I said, you might be wondering why I haven't covered this subject yet. And that's simple. Remember, Abraham Lincoln was shot just a few days later, and he died on April 15th. I covered that 6 years ago in episode 8. Since the events were only a few days apart, and many of the additional history stories would be the same, since news was really slow to get around back then, I didn't bother to cover the important event until today. Now, to be clear, the surrender was very important, but it only marked the beginning of the end of the American Civil War. It was the first big step, you could say. There was one more battle fought in Texas the next month, followed by more surrenders. But it wasn't until August of the next year that President Andrew Johnson issued an official proclamation stating that the conflict was over. For the purpose of this podcast, I'm just covering April 9th, 1865. That morning, the Army of Northern Virginia, led by Robert E. Lee, battled with General Grant's army. It was clear that things were not going well for the Confederate Army, and by the end of the morning, General Lee sent a note to General Grant asking for a meeting. General Grant was very happy. He knew that the meeting would be about surrender, and he sent a note back immediately saying that he was on his way, and asked where they should meet. Between the two armies, there were around 95,000 soldiers. That had to have been a scary sight, for sure, for the people who lived near the battlefield, which was near Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. Most of the villagers had fled when the fighting began, not wanting to get caught in the crossfire. But one family did stay. It was the family of Wilmer McLean. General Lee had sent someone out to find a suitable meeting place within the village of Appomattox Courthouse, and while he was looking, he came upon Wilmer McLean. He hadn't fled with everybody else. He agreed to let the generals meet in his home. General Lee arrived around 1 p.m., and General Grant arrived around 1:30. The men were cordial to each other. They talked about the service they'd both given during the Spanish-American War, and then Lee suggested they get back to business. So Grant showed him a rough draft of the terms of surrender. Basically, it said that the Confederate soldiers would have to surrender all of their weapons, their equipment, and their flags. If they did that, the Union Army would let them keep their horses, their sidearms, and their personal property. Another important part of the surrender was that the soldiers, including the officers, would be considered on parole, and they would be allowed to go back to their homes and families. They wouldn't be sent to prison camps. General Lee's Confederate Army hadn't been doing too well, and they were running low on supplies. General Grant also agreed to send a lot of rations to them, and Lee gladly accepted. After all the terms were agreed upon, official copies were written out. The men signed them, and they shook hands. As Lee rode away, Grant and his team went out onto the porch of the McLean home and removed their hats as a sign of respect. Remember, just a few years earlier, all of these men belonged to the same side. They were part of the same country. During the war, brothers and fathers had fought against each other. It had been an emotionally trying time for all involved. Today, the village of Appomattox Courthouse, including the McLean home, are still standing and designated as a National Historic Park. And you can visit it in Virginia. I think that's a good enough overview of what went down on April 9th, 1865. Now let's open some more newspapers and see what else was making headlines on such an important day in United States history. For my first additional history story of the day, I'm taking a story from the Reynolds newspaper out of London, England, from April 9th, 1865. The headline for this is big. Are you ready? It says, Miscellaneous. Okay, it's not big. I've said it before, and I'm sure I'll say it again, but back in the 1800s and earlier, newspaper formats were a lot different than they are now. Quite often, as is the case for the story I'm about to tell you, all of the articles are under one heading, and it's sometimes hard to know when one story ends and another begins. In this case, each news story starts at a paragraph break. They all just kind of run into each other. The stories might be obituaries, political news, and murder all lumped into one newspaper column. This story caught my eye, though, because it took place in Belgium, and I have a son who will most likely be moving there by the end of this year. We've traveled to Belgium as a family before, and it's a beautiful country. But back in 1865, there was a murder. This article begins by saying, quote, "A mysterious affair is now engrossing the attention of the population of Antwerp." Anytime the words mysterious, an affair, and engrossing are all used in the same sentence, my interest is piqued. To understand this story, we need to back up quite a few years. As one article said, quote, "The narrative properly opens in the year 1856. In that year, a man named William Plaskett Lewis, who lived somewhere in England, passed away. William left behind a wife, Rosamond Pauline Macklin Lewis. I don't know how long William and Rosamond were married, but I know that she had been married before, and she had a son from that previous relationship. His name was Charles Reedley. Now, when William Lewis died, he left Rosamond £25,000. It was a decent amount of money back then. In terms of modern money, it would be a few £1,000,000. All William asked was that she be faithful to his name and his memory. Now, for those of you who know your history, the Crimean War had just ended a few weeks before the surrender in Appomattox Courthouse, here in the U.S. In that war, the Russian Empire fought against a group of allies. Among those allies were the United Kingdom and the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire covered a large area, but at the heart of it was the country of Turkey. Or, as I learned during the most recent World Cup, they prefer the pronunciation of Turkey. Hopefully I got that right. Anyway, like I said, the Crimean War had just ended, and a lot of the soldiers were returning to their homelands after having been away for a few years. A lot of those men were ready and eager to get married. Any woman would do. It didn't matter if they'd been married twice before. At least it didn't matter to a man named Habib Rizk Allah Bey. Let me tell you a little bit about him. Habib was born in 1819 in the country of Lebanon, near Beirut, and then his family moved to Damascus for a while. When he was a young man, he traveled to places like Cyprus, and Turkey, and Malta, and England. Habib had an interest in medicine, so he moved to London to study at the Royal College of Surgeons. He graduated from there in 1850. Then, in 1853, the Crimean War began, and he joined the Ottoman army as a doctor. He received a lot of medals and honors while serving. One of those honors even came with a gift of land. At this time, he was also given the title of Bey, which is basically the same thing as a Viscount in England. Well, after the war, Habib decided he wanted to go back to England, and he became a naturalized citizen there. working as a medical attaché for the Ottoman embassy in London. That's about the time Habib met Rosamond Lewis, and they hit it off. And it didn't take long for them to decide to make their relationship official, and they were married in 1857. Sadly, the quick trip to the altar didn't result in the wedded bliss that Rosamond had hoped for, and she soon learned that Habib wasn't the man she thought he was. He was very cruel to her. Rosamond knew that she had that £25,000 inheritance, and she wanted to make sure that her son Charles received it upon her death, and not Habib. But when she tried to make up a will stating that, Habib found out, and through his great powers of persuasion, apparently, she ended up writing a will where Habib would receive £20,000 and Charles would receive just £5,000 when he came of age. Rosamond ended up getting sick just a few years later, and she passed away in 1860. At the time of her death, I believe Charles was around the age of 15. Since he wasn't yet considered a man, Habib became his official guardian. For the next 5 years, from the time Rosamond died until the spring of 1865, Habib lived large. People knew his name, and his reputation wasn't bad, and since he had money, he spent it lavishly. By 1865, the money Rosamond had left him was pretty much gone. He had to figure out a way to get more money. He knew that Charles was almost of the age to receive his inheritance. Habib also knew that if Charles died, the money would revert back to him if the boy wasn't married. And although he had been looking, Charles hadn't found the right girl yet. Then, in March of 1856, Charles and Habib were staying in a hotel in Antwerp, Belgium, when Charles suddenly became sick. So sick that he was bedridden. Habib was there to take care of him. But one day, Charles died. No, it wasn't from the mysterious illness. He died of a gunshot wound. Charles was found in the bed, tucked under the blankets as if asleep, but he had a hole in his head, and a gun was on the floor next to the bed. On the bedside table next to him was a note that he had written saying, "I have done it." The circumstances of Charles's death seemed suspicious right away. I mean, he was young and had his whole life ahead. Why would he suddenly kill himself over an illness? Was he that sick? Things seemed even more suspicious when it came out that Habib had taken out a £1,000 insurance policy on Charles. So if he suddenly died, Habib would not only get the £5,000 from his inheritance, but he would also get an additional £1,000 from the insurance policy. Everything seemed too convenient, and Habib was arrested and charged with murder. And as more people heard the story and accusations, they started to believe that Habib might have had something to do with Rosamond's death too, although there was no way to prove that. Except, after being locked up for just a short time, Habib was released. There wasn't any evidence to show that he was guilty of killing Charles. So the matter was dropped, and the case was pretty much forgotten. At least for a little bit. A year and a half later, in October of 1866, Habib Rizk Allah Bey finally went on trial. But it wasn't murder that initially got him into the hot seat. He was being charged with forgery and murder. Someone had decided that although there was no tangible proof, there was enough circumstantial evidence that Habib could be charged. And that included being charged the forgery charge that had something to do with insurance papers. Some of the circumstantial evidence against him committing murders also included a close friend who died mysteriously under Habib's care. Because remember, he was a doctor. During the trial, Habib insisted that Charles chose to end his life because nobody would accept his marriage proposals. He also insisted that he didn't know he would inherit Charles's portion of Rosamond's money, but the lawyer who had been in charge of the inheritance insisted that Habib surely knew. During the trial, it also came out that there was a specific girl that Charles wanted to marry, and that's why he was in Antwerp in the first place. He had been communicating with the young lady's parents about marrying her, but when they found out that he suffered from epilepsy, they broke the match between their daughter and Charles. Also during the trial, a reverend spoke and said that the match was actually broken off because the girl's mother didn't think Charles had enough money for her daughter. Either one of those things could have sent Charles into depression. I'll also note that it was pointed out that during every part of the matchmaking, Habib was there, intervening. It was implied that he wanted the money for himself, so he tried to throw kinks in the match, too. During the trial, it was pointed out how suspicious Charles' perfectly poised body had looked when he was found, and how he had felt the need to make sure others knew he had been the one to kill himself. It was all a bit convenient. What did Habib have to say about it? He claimed that Charles could sometimes be violent, and that he had threatened suicide in the past. Other attendants at the hotel said they saw no signs of violence from Charles, and Habib admitted that he did take the gun into the room because Charles requested it. And this made people say that even if Charles was the one that shot himself, Habib definitely knew what was going to happen and aided him in it. Well, there was a lot more that went down in the trial, including information about other charges. But then it was time for Habib Rizk Alibey's guilt or innocence to be decided. And Habib was acquitted. Yep. Despite all of the suspicious things that happened, there just wasn't enough proof to make people believe that he was guilty. Supposedly, the courtroom erupted in applause when he was said to be innocent, and he was immediately set free. So what do you think? Was Habib guilty of murder, or was he just kind of a sleazy guy? Now, the story of Habib doesn't quite end there. After he was acquitted, he got remarried a couple of years later to another wealthy widow. That time it was Mary Letitia Wogan. She too had a son named Charles from a previous marriage, which was a weird coincidence. But things get even more weird. In 1878, Habib was living in Beirut again. Charles Wogan, who was 21 or 22 at the time, decided to follow him, and I assume his mother, and he started attending the American College in Beirut to study Arabic. A very short time later, Charles suddenly disappeared. It had been 13 years since Charles Reedley died, and now Charles Wogan was missing. A few days later, Charles' body was found, washed up on the seashore. His hands were tied together, and it was clear that he had been strangled. Another young Charles had been murdered. Once again, suspicions fell to Habib Rizk Alibey, but it didn't take long for him to be cleared, and 3 other men were charged with Charles' murder. A few months after that, Mary Letitia, Charles Wogan's mother, and Habib's current wife, became sick and died. If you ask me, there were a lot of very suspicious things that happened around that man, but he was never found guilty of any crime related to their deaths. Habib lived for another 20 years after that, and he passed away in Beirut in 1898. For my second additional history story, I'm taking an article from the Louisville Daily Journal out of Louisville, Kentucky. This headline says, "The Double-Bedded Room, a Tragedy." Now, before I tell you this story, I need to make sure you know that there's a very good chance this story is not real. Often, stories were made up, exaggerated, or taken out of context, and passed around from newspaper to newspaper over a very long period of time. Years even. I fear that might be the case with this story, but I'm going to tell it to you anyway, because it's a great story. The man telling the story in this article never actually gives his first name. The story is told in first person, but he refers to his wife as Mrs. Jones, so I'm going to call him Mr. Jones. The story was originally told in a newspaper in New York. One day, Mr. Jones went to a town called Stainton to conduct some business. I believe he must have been some sort of reporter, because his business required that he attend a trial going on there. When Mr. Jones arrived in the town, it was late in the evening, and he was exhausted. He just wanted to get a room at the hotel and fall asleep. Except the hotel was full. Full except for one room that had 2 beds. One of those 2 beds was already occupied by another man. The innkeeper assured Mr. Jones that the man already occupying the room seemed completely normal. He even told Mr. Jones that the man was from the same town as him, and everyone in his town always seemed to be respectable. Since he didn't have any other choice, Mr. Jones agreed to the deal and went up to the room. The other man was already in bed and asleep when Mr. Jones walked in. He studied him for a bit. He seemed like a mild man, maybe around the age of 30, 35. Mr. Jones decided he felt safe enough, so he climbed into the other bed and quickly fell asleep. Then, around midnight, Mr. Jones was suddenly awakened. His roommate was talking in his sleep. Mr. Jones was startled, but he decided to just let the man talk and not try to wake him up. Instead, he listened to what the man was saying. This is what Mr. Jones remembers hearing. "Oh, Mary, how can you cast me off? How can you forget the love that has followed you for so many years, and never turned from you in your misfortune when you stood alone in the world?" Then the sleeping man paused before muttering again, "Say not so, say not so. Before he with his wealth crossed your path, we were happy in each other. And why should I be now cast off after you have sworn by all that is high and good that you would be mine? Ah, Mary, if you reject me, my soul will be given up to some dark deed that will destroy us both. You have chosen your fate, and mark my words, you shall never marry him." And then, with his sleepy rant over, the mysterious man fell asleep again, and Mr. Jones was left to ponder everything he had just heard. Who was Mary, and why had she seemingly destroyed the man next to him? Needless to say, Mr. Jones was surprised, but he wasn't that worried. At one point he feared he might lose his own wife to another man, so he sympathized with the stranger and his worry about Mary. Well, the next morning the men left the room at different times, so they never really talked to each other. But Mr. Jones was surprised when he saw the man in court at the same trial he'd gone to Stainton to attend. The man was in the audience, listening very intently to every word spoken. Much to Mr. Jones's surprise, the trial was for a man accused of murdering his betrothed. The murdered young woman had lived in New York City for a while when she met a very poor young man. She fell in love and agreed to marry him. But then a wealthy rival came along and convinced her to break off her engagement. When she was killed, the poor former fiancé was the only person in the house besides the deceased girl. To many, it was clear that he had killed her. The most important thing you need to know, though, is that Mary was the name of the girl who was killed. It was the same name and the same story that the roommate had been mumbling about in his sleep just the night before. Why was he at the trial? Why did he have so much interest in it? Judging by the roommate's threadbare clothing, he didn't have a lot of money, and according to the innkeeper, he'd come from New York, the same place Mary had lived. As far as Mr. Jones was concerned, the stranger had no other reason to be in town. He started to wonder if the stranger in his room was somehow the real young man that was supposed to be on trial. Had something gotten messed up? Was the wrong person in custody? That night, Mr. Jones went to bed first. When his roommate came into the room, he pretended to be asleep. The man paced back and forth in the room, mumbling more stuff about Mary, and said, quote, "I see no other way. I'll do it." Needless to say, Mr. Jones was more worried than ever. The next day, both men were in court again, and the stranger seemed just as focused on the trial as the day before. Later that night, the stranger was seen pacing back and forth on the outskirts of town, head down, hands clasped behind his back. At the dinner table at the hotel, he ate in complete silence after the others had already eaten. And then he sat in front of the fireplace and just stared into it. His actions were peculiar, but since he wasn't hurting anyone, and since Mr. Jones didn't have proof of anything, he just let the stranger be, and he went to bed. A little while later, the stranger entered the room, and completely ignored Mr. Jones, who pretended to be sound asleep in his bed. The stranger sat down at the little table in their room, pulled out some paper and a pen, and a little black bottle. He began to write. He wrote, and he wrote, and he wrote. It was as if his thoughts were burning their way out of his head, and he couldn't get them out fast enough. All the time he wrote, Mr. Jones lay still. The stranger had no idea that he was awake, watching. Finally, the stranger threw down his pen, slapped himself in the forehead, and said, "I did it, and now she is gone. Why do I tarry here to see that poor wretch suffer in my stead? 'Twas as I said, she did not marry him. There's comfort in that. I loved her well, so well, that I did slay her." The stranger continued his muttering, completely forgetting that someone else was in the room with him. Mr. Jones probably couldn't have slept at that point if his life depended on it. And then, through half-closed eyes, he watched as the stranger picked up the little black bottle and took a swig. Then he wrote some more and took another swig. He continued this until the bottle appeared to be empty. Then he stood and in dim candlelight said what Mr. Jones believed was his farewell to life. Quote, "They shall know that what I swore I had the courage to perform. I'll to my couch, and let the morrow tell a tale of horror which shall make their drowsy souls believe there is a love far stronger than grim death. Farewell, earth, where gold doth rob me of my love, and hail, thou strange unknown, where she doth wait my coming." Then he very dramatically fell upon his bed and seemed to be gone. Mr. Jones believed he had just witnessed the man's suicide. At first, he thought he should jump out of bed and get help. But if the young man had already committed murder, there was no sense in trying to save his life, only to have him hang later, right? So instead of telling anyone, he continued to lie in his bed until sleep overcame him. The next morning, Mr. Jones got up and looked around the room. The stranger was still on the bed, on top of the blankets, where he'd fallen the night before. The papers were still on the table, along with the little black bottle, now empty. The papers appeared to have the confession of a murderer, and the little black bottle had a skull and crossbones on it, the clear mark of poison. I guess Mr. Jones figured he didn't want to play a part in it because he packed his things, went downstairs, ate some breakfast, paid his bill, and then he left, figuring he'd read about the suicide in the papers in the coming days. He never sounded an alarm about his roommate's demise. But he waited and waited. He read paper after paper, and nothing was ever reported about a death in Staunton. He started to wonder if he'd imagined the whole thing. Was he the one that was losing his mind? Several weeks passed, and then Mr. Jones had the chance to attend a new play that was being performed in the city. He arrived and found his seat and began to watch the actors portraying a story of love and murder. The play was eerily similar to the events that had unfolded on his business trip a few weeks earlier, while pretending to sleep in the room with 2 beds. He became more and more confused as he watched scene after scene. When the actor, supposedly writing out a confession, suddenly slapped himself in the forehead, drank some poison, and then staggered over to a couch and fell dramatically upon it, Mr. Jones was truly baffled. He'd seen it all before. Even the words the actor spoke were the exact same ones the stranger had muttered to himself that night. When the play ended, the audience cheered and clapped and stomped their feet. One audience member in particular got really into the cheering. Mr. Jones finally looked over at him, and in that moment, everything began to fall into place. The exuberant audience member was none other than his roommate, the strange man he believed to have died. The man was a playwright, and he was writing from real-life events. He attended the trial to make sure he got all of the details right, and since he was spending so much time thinking about the script, it only made sense that his dialogue might come back out while he was sleeping. Mr. Jones approached the young playwright and said, "I think I have seen it acted before." Yes, the night he thought he was witnessing his suicide, the playwright was acting out the final scene, trying to make sure he had it just right. So, what about the poison? There was a good explanation for it. The man liked to keep a little brandy with him, but if others knew what was in the bottle, it always seemed to disappear faster. They would take a swig too. He started drinking from a bottle marked as poison, because nobody else dared sneak a swig of poison. So what do you think? Was this story true or completely made up? For my third and final additional history story from April 9th, 1865, I'm taking an article from the Morning Herald out of St. Joseph, Missouri. The headline says, David Matson. Now, I told you I doubted the truthfulness of the last story I told. Let me just say that I doubt the truthfulness of the story I'm about to tell you even more than the last one. Why? Because the author of this article, a man named John G. Whittier, started off his story by comparing it to a poem by Alfred Tennyson, and then wrote, I can assure my readers it is a true tale. In my experience, if you have to try to convince people that something is true, it's probably because it's made up. This story was written by a man, like I said, named John G. Whittier. Usually I don't tell you about the author, but I'm making the exception in this case. You see, John G. Whittier, or John Greenleaf Whittier, is pretty famous. He was born and raised in Massachusetts and grew up to be a writer and a poet. He was a very religious man, and a lot of that was reflected in his poems, some of which were turned into hymns. John was famous enough that Whittier, California, Whittier, Alaska, Whittier, Iowa, and Greenleaf, Idaho were all named after him. Whittier College and Whittier Law School were also named after him, as were multiple mountains and a World War II ship, amongst other things. But the thing I really want you to know about John Greenleaf Whittier, because it fits with the Civil War theme of this episode, is that John was a well-known abolitionist, and he published a lot of anti-slavery literature. For a while, he was the editor of a newspaper called the Pennsylvania Freeman, an anti-slavery paper out of Philadelphia. Like I said, I'm pretty sure this is just a fictional story written by a great author, but you never know. Maybe there's some truth to it. According to John, it took place in his New England neighborhood many decades earlier, and it was a story he had heard many times growing up. Okay, here we go. In this New England town lived a man named David Matson. He was young and had a wife, Anna, and 2 healthy little boys. Life was wonderful for the little family. But David was a sailor, and that meant that he had to spend a lot of time at sea. One morning, his little family walked him down to the river, where he waited for a man named Palladia Curtis to come by with his little ferry to take him and other crew members a few miles down the river to the port. The ship that they would use to sail to Spain was known as the Lively Turtle. When Palladia Curtis arrived, David's wife and sons tried to be strong, but it was hard to say goodbye because they knew that David would be gone for a very long time. From the moment he sailed away, they looked forward to the day when they would all be together again. The summer months passed, and then autumn came and went. The winter, though harder, passed too, and soon it was spring. And then summer again. Every day, Anna and the boys hoped that that would be the day that David returned. But it never happened. Another year passed, and everyone believed that the Lively Turtle was gone. It could be added to the list of ships lost at sea. Anna started to wear mourning clothes, and everyone now called her Widow Matson. But far across the sea, the story wasn't what everyone thought. You see, the Lively Turtle had sailed along the Barbary coast, and it was known amongst sailors that there were some people in places like Algiers and Tripoli who weren't exactly stand-up citizens. They were pirates, and they would raid the merchant ships, especially from Christian nations like the United States. And then they would capture the crew and passengers and turn them into slaves. As a side note, I just want to say that, yes, this really did happen in history. Anyway, such was the case of the Lively Turtle. The ship was captured, and David and his crewmates were taken to the market and sold into slavery. Because David knew about carpentry, something that he learned from his father, he was put to work at the docks. And David got lucky. His master was actually a nice guy, and he didn't overwork his slaves. He gave them 3 meals a day, and when their clothing wore out, he'd make sure they got new stuff, made from wool and camel's hair, that would hold up to the work they were doing. Every day, a few hours before sunset, David would be allowed to stop working for the day. And since Algeria was an Islamic country, and Friday is a holy day, he didn't have to work at all on Fridays. Every year when Ramadan rolled around, he was given a whole week off. For as easy as David had it compared to some of the other slaves, he still missed his wife and kids terribly, and dreamed every day of seeing them again. He wondered what his boys looked like. He wondered if they knew what had happened to him, and if they ever thought about him. Days passed, months passed, and then the years began to pass, and still David was a slave. Slowly, his dreams of seeing his family started to fade. And then, one day, a handsome, middle-aged man dressed like an American and accompanied by guards showed up at the shipyard. It had been years since David had seen someone like that, I'm sure. The man called for all of the American slaves to come over. He said that he was Joel Barlow, a commissioner of the United States. And as a side note here again, yes, Joel Barlow really did serve as a consul from the U.S. to Algeria. Joel looked at all of the slaves and told them that they had been freed. At first they were shocked and didn't know how to react, but as it sunk in, they whooped and hollered and wept for joy. David fell to his knees, thanking God for his freedom. Now, while living as a slave, David had earned a little bit of money by working odd jobs in his free time and on holidays. He used the money to get to Spain. There he bought a shawl for his wife Anna and a watch for each of his boys. He couldn't wait to get back to them to give them the gifts. When he got down to the port, he found an American ship that was just getting ready to sail back to Boston. He knew he needed to get passage on that ship, and he hurried to talk to the crew. As soon as he got on board, he saw a familiar face. It was none other than Palladia Curtis. Remember that name from earlier in this story? It was David's neighbor, back in Massachusetts, the man who ran the local ferry that would pick up sailors and take them to their ships at the port. 7 years had passed, though, and Palladia had believed David to be dead all those years. With his long beard, dressed in clothes from Algeria, he wasn't recognizable. Palladia didn't know who he was. David decided to keep his identity private for a little longer, and he began to question Palladia about his home life. He asked the man if he knew Anna Matson, and Palladia said of course he knew her. It was his wife. David couldn't hide his identity any longer, and he began to yell that Anna was his wife and her kids were his kids. Palladia insisted she was his wife too, and that they too had a young child. The men went back and forth with their arguing, and Palladia insisted he was not going to give Anna up. David knew that if he returned, it would mess things up. Maybe Anna wouldn't even love him anymore and would choose Palladia. He couldn't take that pain again. So he decided to give her up. He handed the shawl and watches that he'd purchased for his family over to Palladia and asked him to give them to his family. Then he shook hands with Palladia, told him to be kind to his family, and he left the ship. When Palladia returned home, he handed over the gifts and told Anna what he had learned of her first husband. She wept and wept. Many years passed, and Anna refused to ever wear the shawl that David had sent to her. But rumor had it that her dying wish was to be buried with the shawl wrapped around her shoulders. As to what happened to David Matson, nobody knows. For today's advertisement, I'm taking an ad from the Nashville Daily Union out of Nashville, Tennessee. This ad on page 2 is for S.B. Howe's Great European Circus. It was nice to see that even though a war was raging in the country, people were still able to get out and have fun, including in places like Nashville, where there'd been a battle just a few months earlier. This particular circus had a lot to offer, including performing kangaroos, a lion tamer, and an elephant named Jenny Lind. Yes, it was named after the woman their competitor, P.T. Barnum, brought from Europe to travel the country as a singer. Friends, thanks for listening to today's episode, as we took a look back at what was happening around the country and world the day General Lee and General Grant had a very important meeting in the village of Appomattox Courthouse. Join me again in 2 weeks from today for another all-new episode. For those of you listening from the United States, you can enjoy your Labor Day by listening to a random clippings episode, since I haven't done one for an entire year. Talk to you later.